3 years after U.S. President Donald Trump initiated a trade war with China, U.S. companies are calling for the Biden administration to resume negotiations with Beijing. We'll discuss what's at stake for both countries. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. A group of the largest retail associations in the United States is appealing to President Biden to resume trade talks with China and ease the burden on U.S. companies. They say the tariffs on Chinese products are hurting their bottom line. We begin with this report from Malone in Washington.
American businesses are hurting from U.S.-imposed tariffs that were supposed to pressure China to change its trade practices. One of them is United Legwear and Apparel Co., which holds exclusive rights to source, manufacture and import brands to the U.S., such as Puma, Hurley, Champions and Skechers.
Vietnam was shut down until very recently.
Christopher Volpe is the Chief Operating and Financial Officer. He says the tariffs have forced them to shift their sourcing base for some of their products out of China to other countries in Southeast Asia, North Africa and Latin America. They've moved apparel and other products elsewhere, but for now 90% of his legwear products are still made in China at a cost.
We manufacture over 350 million pairs of socks a year, and the demand for that and the need for infrastructure is tremendous. And these third-party developing nations don't have the infrastructure that China has, which has been built over decades. So it's been very challenging.
That's been the common experience of many companies in the United States since the tariffs were first introduced by former President Trump in 2018. A number of influential American business groups have written a letter urging the Biden administration to restart trade talks with China and cut tariffs on Chinese-made goods. The National Retail Federation represents 16,000 member companies across the United States. One official says businesses are facing a 25% tax on products imported from China, costs that are sometimes passed on to consumers.
So we've seen a significant impact of the China tariffs, not just on imports of finished goods, which are key for NRF members, but also inputs to production that U.S. manufacturers need, whether it's component parts, chemicals, or other things they need to make products here in the United States and then export them back out. So those tariffs from the outset, we've always said, have been a tax on U.S. businesses. And to date, U.S. Customs and Border Protection has collected close to $100 billion in tariffs. Those are taxes on U.S. companies. It's not China who pays the tariffs, but U.S. importers who pay the tariffs, and unfortunately end up passing those along to consumers.
Well, business groups say the tariffs are adding pressures and costs onto U.S. companies already suffering in the COVID-19 pandemic. Add to that shipping and container delays. Well, even though retail sales have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, some businesses have already gone under. For policy research group American Action Forum, it's clear the tariffs have had a negative impact, costing the U.S. economy and especially business about $50 billion a year.
We would really like to see the United States embrace its traditional role as the leader of free trade. That means allowing U.S. businesses to really take the best position that they themselves can find themselves in. Now, at the same time, there can be more targeted mechanisms by the United States.
The White House press secretary recently said that President Biden plans to continue using everything in his toolbox to fight against unfair trade practices. There's an ongoing review of policies, but no clear timeline. For U.S. businesses, any change to lift the burden of tariffs can't come soon enough. Caroline Malone, CGTN, Washington, D.C.
Top executives from China and the United States discussed efforts to move forward and reshape relations in a virtual U.S. China Business Forum on Tuesday, organized by Forbes China. Our first guest was among the participants. Craig Allen served as a U.S. ambassador to Brunei and is currently the president of the U.S. China Business Council. He's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Allen, I want to get your take on this forum in a bit, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about the story we just aired from Malone. It highlights how a lot of companies here in the U.S. still kind of taking it on the chin because of this trade war. Some of them absorbing the cost of these tariffs, others passing it along to consumers. There was a recent report from Bloomberg Economics where they said the trade war on the U.S. economy cost about $316 billion by the end of 2020. A more recent study by Columbia University and the New York Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Bank, found the different number of $1.7 trillion in the price of stocks lost to U.S. companies because of the trade war. So I want to get your sense of what your members are saying and what's the appetite for a change in direction.
So thanks very much, Mike, for this opportunity. It is absolutely clear that the trade war has hurt a lot of people on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. And in the United States, our own research suggests that up to 245,000 jobs were lost. I think that understates the problem, however. The long-term consequences of the trade war are much larger over time than the short-term consequences. And so we are hopeful that the two governments will be able to convene shortly to address the market access issues that remain in China, and then to remove the tariffs going both ways across the Pacific. The U.S. companies are not the only ones hurting. I think many Chinese companies are unhappy with the situation as well. So for the good of both economies, for workers, farmers, and ranchers in both countries, the sooner we get back to the table to address real problems, the better off we are. And we're hopeful that that will take place in 2021.
Well, you talked about this forum put on by Forbes China. The theme was gaining momentum. Two words I think you'd like to see. Are we seeing any momentum gain? Because I know you had exhibited a sense of anxiousness that there's only 4 months left on this trade deal, this U.S. China trade deal. And the sense I got from listening to you, I don't want to put words into your mouth, is it's about time for everybody to sit down at the table and start hashing things out.
Well, I do think it's time to sit down at the table and hash things out. But the United States government is undergoing a policy review, and we understand that we're close to the end of that process. And that is why now is a good time to think about the modalities of the next meeting and to consider what will be the format going forward. So we're hopeful that while this might not be instantaneous, we're hopeful that in the over the course of the fall and by the end of the year, that we will have that we will understand what are the parameters of the trade and the investment relationship. What will the tariffs be? And under what conditions can we do business with each other? The fundamental role of government, and I would say this of the Chinese government as well as the U.S. government, is to provide some certainty, clarity, and a rule of law so that businesses can plan what they their investments and what they need to do. And right now, businesses on both sides of the Pacific are lacking in clarity and uncertain about what the basic parameters of their business will be over the longer term. And so I think that both governments need to sit down. This is not the sole problem of the U.S. government by any means. It is both governments need to sit down. We support the elimination of tariffs and the simultaneous improvement in market access to the Chinese market. Progress can be made on both of those issues. There are win-wins available here for the taking.
So, as president of the U.S. China Business Council, I imagine you've got your finger on the pulse. I mean, what are members saying? How uneasy are they about this relationship? And are they more optimistic now? I mean, as you said, there's a review underway, but pretty much it's business as usual. I mean, a lot of what we saw with Trump, we're seeing with Biden.
Well, it's business as usual in terms of the investment flows and the trade flows on the ground are carrying on. American business continues to do well in China. There was a pretty good recovery in U.S. exports in 2020 that we hope will continue into 2021. So it is business as normal between the two countries. The policy environment, I would agree, has not changed a lot from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And that is as a result of this ongoing review that is currently underway. And the hope is that this review will be completed sometime soon. Then we will be able to move to a structure and a structure of negotiations and a structure of trade and investment that's clear, transparent, fair, free as possible, notwithstanding legitimate national security concerns.
So, Craig, this broad review of policies towards China, let's say it comes to an end. Pronouncements are made by the Biden administration. What will be something that you will hear that will give you some encouragement?
Well, we absolutely wish the Biden administration well in negotiations to reducing trade barriers in China. And we hope that there is a more level playing field in China for all sorts of American companies. But let me just name financial services, media, government procurement, and many, many others. So if we were to see a indication that the Chinese government is moving towards a more open China, a more fair environment for foreign companies in the very large Chinese market, that would be extremely encouraging, not only to American firms, but to European, Japanese, and indeed, I would say, to Chinese private sector firms who are also under pressure by state-owned enterprises.
Ambassador, before I let you go, since you've been in the diplomatic ranks, you just had an opportunity as the president of the council to have a virtual discussion with the new ambassador from China to the United States, Gong. Give me your sense of what your takeaways were having a chance to visit with him.
Well, I think that the ambassador is a truly remarkable diplomat who is taking on a difficult assignment at a difficult time. And I'm hopeful that he will continue the path of his predecessor, who used careful diplomacy and avoided the megaphone, and that he will be able to make progress in this difficult environment. It is clear that he is a new generation of a Chinese minister and ambassador. I wish him every success as he grapples with the most important bilateral relationship in the world. A bilateral relationship that is currently fraught with many problems and that needs careful diplomacy, quiet diplomacy, and discussions between the top leadership to put us into a place of strategic stability for both sides, where both sides can prosper and continue to deliver prosperity, stability, predictability to its citizens and people around the world. And we're not there. We have quite a ways to go.
Well, let's hope we get there, Ambassador Allen. Always a delight talking to you. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more on China-U.S. trade relations, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. From Los Angeles, Ryan Patel is a global business executive and senior fellow with the Drucker School of Management at Claremont Graduate University. And Gong is an economics professor at Beijing's University of International Business and Economics. He's joining us from Israel. And John, I'm going to start with you. I want to touch on a few things that Ambassador Allen said. He says his members want an improvement in market access. They want to move and have a more level playing field, market liberalization and reform. That's been the clarion call here in the United States from business folks for quite some time. But this cuts both ways. I've spoken to a number of folks who want to break into the U.S. market from China, and they talk about the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, also known as CFIUS, and they say that there's been a lot of roadblocks erected. And if you look at the numbers, the facts are there. I mean, they want fewer restrictions in China, and yet you're seeing more roadblocks here in the United States. Volume in 2018 was just under $8 billion, foreign investment from China coming into the United States. 2 years earlier, in 2016, it was $64 billion. So that's trending in the wrong direction, too. That's part of the story we don't hear very much of, though, isn't it, John?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that the investment from China in the United States, a year, 2 years ago was almost came down to nothing basically. It recovers a little bit, but.
Okay, we're having trouble with this shot from Israel. Let me go to Liang. I'll point the question in your direction. Give me your sense on this and how CFIUS has kind of impacted things. Both sides are actually suffering in this trade war.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's clear that the reduction in FDI has to do with CFIUS's roadblock, right, against China's acquisition in the U.S. firms, especially tech firms. At the same time, I think the Chinese government is also restricting capital outflows. So there is sort of two tango kind of scenario. That said, I do see that the portfolio investments, the two-way portfolio holdings, remain pretty strong. Right now, we're looking at about $3.3 trillion of a two-way holding of portfolio investment that includes equity and bonds. So I think, there's still a lot of capital flow between the two countries, and that is really, what businesses desire, which is tap into each other's markets. And I think, the ambassador mentioned about, Qinggang, he mentioned that the door has been opened between the two countries. So in addition to trade and capital flows, we also have people exchanges, knowledge production, so on and so forth. So I think it is time, as he said, for both countries to really resume that talks and hopefully resume that normal business operations between the two countries.
John, technology is not always our friend, but you're back, and I want to maybe kind of get you to talk a little bit further about this issue, because we're actually seeing China kind of tilting towards Europe. They are relaxing some barriers. Europe's moving into China, and China also moving into Europe. So there are other avenues for China. Talk to us about this impact and trying to erect these roadblocks, and what kind of impact we can see long term from it.
Well, this is a worrisome view. I have some, very great concern about, the investment flows from China. It looks like among the company executives I've talked to, they're pretty much given up the idea that the long-term prospect of investment in the United States is not going to be good. So, they're going to Europe. They're talking to European companies. They're talking to other companies. So I think this is a problem that the United States government is losing steam on this. And remember, the original rationale for starting the trade war is to improve the investment environment in China for American companies. And I think this argument is becoming less and less irrelevant in my view, because if you look at the American companies in China, they're doing very well actually, even amid very difficult global environment right now due to the pandemic situation. You can always argue there's room for improvement. Or you can always argue that it's not 100% level playing field in China. But overall, there's a great improvement, I think, especially in the financial sector over the years for American companies. So this argument that this is the unfair trade practices in China for business environment for American companies is becoming very tenuous at this point, in my view. And the other argument is about trade flow, right? But if you look at the American exports to China for the first half of the year, this is probably the strongest growth, represents the strongest growth sector among trade flows, both for exports and imports. it was in by 40% for American exports to China, particularly the agricultural sector. I mean, I don't know if you know this number. The agricultural exports, American exports to China, more than doubled in the last 6 months. So I think the entire rationale for the trade war proposed by ex-President Trump is actually going away, in my view. There are still a very large trade deficit from a U.S. perspective, but I think this is more structural in nature as opposed to due to some trade practices.
Ryan, I want to bring you into the conversation. I was reading a piece in the Associated Press. They interviewed Yu Lee, an international relations professor in Beijing. He assessed the administration's approach this way. He said, there's a huge deviation between what they believe China is and what China really is, and their China policy. Their policies are based on illusions, which will result in some bad consequences. And I think if you talk to some people in the business world here in the U.S., they'd say that the trade war is an example of that. The Trump administration basically thought that China would capitulate, they'd scream uncle, and everything would go their way. And even the Atlantic Council was out with a report earlier this year that said after 4 years, the verdict's in. The United States, seems to have suffered worse consequences than China. Talk to us about this perception versus reality component of this.
Well, I mean, there's the first aspect is it's almost like a reset, right? I mean, I think what both sides, the perception and what needs to happen is we've been talking about how both sides need to come together, but the reality is something has to happen. An event has to happen. Businesses, or specifically on the U.S., needs to put either more pressure on the administration to come to the table. There's a lot of things going on in the U.S. right now. And I think the second piece of this, Mike, is both countries. Greater challenges is in maintaining the progress. So as much as we're talking about, well, they're going to come to the table, they're kind of growing, that's not really the main portion of this policy. The policy question is, at the long-term view, how can they both maintain the growth process in the future? Because I think that's where the jockeying is happening between both countries. It's not about, well, let's flow some trade here and there short-term. It's really jockeying for a position where they both can excel. But both countries, specifically the U.S. and China, have to want to do that, and that's where it's going to have to come from pressure from the business community. And we've seen that over the last 4 years when it got more vocal. Things start to kind of heat up, but right now there isn't that heat up aspect because the voice isn't loud enough, if you can believe that or not.
Ryan, it's interesting you bring that up because Myron Brilliant of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce tweeted this just yesterday. We can't afford to put trade policy on the back burner. American businesses need certainty when it comes to the administration's China policy, which is why we want some action. Is that the kind of pressure you're talking about, a chorus of these voices coming forth, and are we seeing enough of that?
Well, it has to, because let's think about this, Mike. While the global economy starts to open up, people are starting to look at growth, right? It's going to be great for 2-3 months. Business is kind of be back, but they're going to be focusing on the bottom line. Where are they going to get the margins? How can they increase that? Well, Mike, they're going to look back at, well, we're already doing everything that we can on label. What is it on the trade that we can get the margins? Oh, wait, there's multiple basis points should the tariffs go away. And that's going to be the natural progression, even though, Mike, you and I both know that's where it needs to go right away. But there's going to be a progression of months when it gets to that point. And when it gets to that point, when businesses feel even more pressure, that's when that conversation is going to happen, because there's no other place that you can get the bottom line to get better except for having these big trade agreements.
And Liang, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is an outspoken critic of this trade war. There was a report in Bloomberg saying that she might be traveling to Beijing and meeting with Vice Premier Liu He. What would be the next step in the right direction, do you think? Talk to us about, because we've seen a couple of these meetings. The one in Alaska seemed rather contentious. The one in Tianjin didn't seem to produce much in the way of results. What needs to happen?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly what needs to be happening, which is, the pragmatic policymakers would talk to each other about, how to rebuild this relationship and build this mutually beneficial, economic connections between the two countries. And, piggyback on the previous speakers, I think, just at the beginning of August, there were 30 trade associations, organizations has written a letter to plead for the full removal of tariffs. So it's clear that the tariffs is not good for the business, is not good for the consumers. are not good for the economy. Janet Yellen herself has declared that these tariffs are borne by consumers and it's hurting the consumers' interest. But I think what's happening now, for one, is it's a complicated economic question. There's so much integration between the two countries. It's difficult to have this comprehensive and strategic review. That's why it's taking long, right? 7 months already passed. And second, I think it's really critical is that political view. I think a lot of these economic relationships have been politicized. But I think even for political reasons, I think for Biden, it's important that the farmers are happy to do business with China. And John Gong was talking about, as a matter of fact, China has fulfilled 90% of the year-to-target agriculture purchases in the Phase 1 trade deal. And also for workers, they're looking at 245,000 jobs losses due to this trade war. And that is undermining Biden's political base. And not to mention the global leadership, where Biden talked about rebuild the world, bring a better, rebuild a better world. But when it comes to economics, I don't think he's having any sort of multilateral economic systems in mind at this point. So I think important, not only just from an economic point of view, but also from a political point of view, that Biden should start really think about accelerate that talks and really think about some pragmatic measures to reset the economic relationships.
John, President Biden described China as the top competitor for the United States. In June, he signed this executive order banning U.S. companies in investing in 59 companies with alleged ties to China's military and surveillance industry. What's been the impact of that decision?
Well, there's some impact, but I think the impact is very limited. I mean, this idea of technology exchanges is pretty much dead here in China. I think many Chinese companies are operating on the assumption that the technology decoupling is happening and it will be there for some time. I think the problem with the Biden administration is that he still views the tariff as a tool to deal with China. But I think it's becoming more and more irrelevant because in economics, we have this theory about who is actually paying for the tariff. Study after study is showing that it's the American companies, importers, and ultimately the American consumers are paying for it. So, from China's perspective, I think the government at least views the tariff as something that's hurting Americans more than hurting Chinese companies, Chinese exporters, and to some extent, American companies operating in China that are exporting goods to the United States as well. Mm-hmm. I think the effectiveness of this trade tools, the tariff itself is becoming less and less important to the Chinese government. Yeah.
Let me take that as a jumping off point. We've only got about 20 seconds. Ryan, I'm going to give you the last question. How do you sell that to domestic audience? We're losing jobs and you're paying for these tariffs so that they can be on board.
Well, that doesn't sound so great, huh, Mike? When you say it to that degree, I think it's just, at the end of the day, you got to show results and partnership. The word key here is partnership. So if Biden has to come domestically, here's what we're gonna get, here's what it's gonna be a direct impact to the economy, the infrastructure. It has to be really clear, as Professor mentioned, she mentioned, that it has become politicized. So it's got to be facts, results, and super clear that nobody can twist them.
All right, I want to thank our panelists for joining us. Great discussion there. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.